On the face of it, last Thursday was a truly dire night for the Conservatives. But if you look a little closer, it wasn't exactly a great night for Labour either. In Britain's first major democratic exercise, following what has been a seismic year for the nation, voters have made their voices heard. And the results make for fascinating reading. In this week's episode of the podcast, we're unpicking what these results really mean. Can Keir Starmer finish his overhaul of the Labour Party and get himself the keys to number 10? Or will Rishi Sunak rescue the Conservatives from the electoral abyss and continue their 13 years in charge? We're holding up in Westminster with our political editor Hugo and political reporter Chloe Chaplain from our lobby team to find out more. Thank you both so much for joining us. I'd like to start with the Conservatives for obvious reasons. Hugo, what went wrong?
Well, I mean, what went wrong is actually pretty obvious to anyone who's been paying any attention over the last year. The local elections this time a year ago were not great for the Conservatives. You know, Partygate questions were swirling, the cost of living crisis was starting to bite. Since then, almost everything has gone wrong and very little has gone right. You know, they lost Boris Johnson, they had a brutal leadership contest, Liz Truss won her mini-budget, crashed the markets, contributed to the ever-worsening economic chaos that was happening anyway. They lost Liz Truss, and they cratered in the polls and at one point were 30 points behind. So, you know, that fundamentally is what went wrong. There have been questions too about the quality of their local campaigning. Did they have the right message? You know, was Sunak playing the right role? But ultimately, that was only ever going to make a difference at the margin. And this was the first chance for voters to have a formal say on the state of the country, the state of the government, and what they said really was very negative, which shouldn't be a surprise given the context.
So if it wasn't a surprise that this has gone pretty poorly, how bad was it on the metrics of this is probably going to be terrible?
It was on the day a bit worse than expected. Listeners might have noticed the Conservatives were trying to push this projection that they might lose up to 1,000 council seats. And what every party does before elections is they pick on the worst possible outcome for them. They keep pushing it so that hopefully they do better than that. And then they can say, well, we defied expectations. This time round, that didn't happen. They actually did slightly worse, lost more than 1,000 seats. So it was at the poorer end of expectations. That said, the one little piece of consolation is it probably was a bit better than it might have been, say, 6 months ago, you know, immediately after the disastrous Truss era. In the end, and I'm sure we'll get on to these issues shortly, but they were about 9 percentage points behind Labour, which is bad, but not total Tory wipeout territory if that were repeated at a general election.
And what can we learn from the sort of geographical spread of their losses? Have there been any particular patterns in terms of where they got hit really badly?
Well, again, the bad news is that they seem to have gone backwards nearly everywhere. I mean, among the councils they lost, you might point out Plymouth in the far southwest, Medway in Kent, and then a number in the north as well. So, you know, they're going backwards to some extent everywhere. There were some places where they did not so badly. A couple of places in the Midlands, Sandwell Council near Birmingham is one that's been picked out. And that gives them a bit of hope because that does suggest that this sort of realignment in British politics that we've seen for the last 10 or 15 years now, with places in the North and Midlands that supported Brexit becoming more conservative over time, that process is continuing despite the ups and downs of the electoral calendar. But that probably is going to be fairly cold comfort for Rishi Sunak.
So if you were, talking to Rishi Sunak the day after, you're looking at the election results, what positives are you giving him to soften the blow? What takeaways are you getting from this in terms of glimmers of hope?
I think the only real glimmer of hope for the Tories is that Labour did not do as well as a party that is on course for a huge majority would be expected to do. And as I say, the other one is the fact that they didn't do as badly as some of their poll ratings have suggested. Rishi Sunak believes that he is on the right track. He's taking the Tories in the right direction. He's got a year to a year and a half till the next general election. His argument will be that if they can deliver on their promises and solve the cost of living crisis, improve the NHS and bring immigration under control, that he's got a hope. But, you know, in the details of last week's results, there's not much to specifically cheer them.
Well, let's talk about Labour. Chloe, they did do quite well, you know, on balance. So how did that happen? What went well for them?
Yeah, so in the lead up to the elections, Labour were very clear that the seats up, you know, didn't include places like London, Scotland, where they historically have done very well. And there was a lot of expectation management going on around how, you know, they're starting from a difficult place. They did well in these elections in 2019, and therefore they weren't expecting big gains. And, you know, they were obviously right about that. Some of the significant successes have been, as Hugo mentioned earlier, places like Kent, in Swindon as well, where they won the council off the Conservatives. In Plymouth, these places have been very much dominated by Conservatives for many, and, you know, Swindon, I think, for really years and years and years has been, Swindon North and Swindon South have both been Conservative constituencies. And so now Labour are arguing, OK, well, maybe we didn't win all of the councils in the North East or the Midlands in the so-called Red Wall area, but this shows that the change to support us is quite broad across the country. They believe, and this is from their analysis of the results, that this indicates that they could win these kind of constituencies where they haven't won for some forever and others for many, many years. But I think it's interesting to Hugo's point about where things didn't go so badly for the Tories. In places like the West Midlands and the North East, quite a lot of councils, the Conservatives lost, but they lost in overall control. And that's kind of a criticism of Labour's performance, which has been highlighted by those on the left of the party, kind of saying that essentially Labour can't rely on just the Tory vote to implode. They have to be performing strongly themselves. And some of these councils that have gone from Conservative control to no overall control indicates exactly what they're warning of, which is that, OK, maybe people aren't backing the Tories anymore, but are they really coming out in force behind Labour and Keir Starmer's vision?
So it's more potentially people falling out of love with the Tories, which, as Hugo said, is not a surprise, than potentially being madly in love with Labour and Starmer.
I think it's important to note that in these areas like Kent and Swindon, that, you know, there are real signs that voters are really shifting from being Conservative supporting to actually saying, no, we think now Labour is the party to lead the country. And, you know, that's not to be dismissed. But in these local election results, that's not been seen to the extent across the rest of the country as I think it would need to be for Labour to be kind of sure of a really strong majority.
Interesting. And the wild card, or maybe not, Lib Dems, brilliant night for them. Give us an overview of where they won big and what that might mean.
Well, you're right. They put on hundreds of seats, which, given that obviously they are smaller than either the Tories or Labour, proportionally they did, I think, the best of any party. They did particularly well in what they love to refer to as the blue wall. So Windsor and Maidenhead was the sort of iconic one that declared pretty early on that Ed Davey went to on Friday. Their whole strategy right now is built around being the alternative to the Conservatives in seats where Labour can't win. And based on that, they have done extremely well. Places like Windsor, Bracknell, places that you just wouldn't expect Labour to be winning a general election anytime soon. The Lib Dems are now quite clearly the main challenger to the Tories, and that's their core strategy for the next election. That is where they want to be, so it really could barely have gone better for them, I think.
And how much of a surprise is that? Do they generally do well at a local level? I mean, we've seen them creep up, haven't we, over the past few months? How much of a shock was this that they did so well?
Well, in Windsor and Maidenhead in particular, the Lib Dems have always been the second party in that area. In fact, they actually did have a lot of councillors after the last set of local elections. So it's not too much of a shock. These areas, and not wishing to generalise too much on obviously the mixture of voters that live in these places, but a lot of them are Conservative-minded generally, but not really pro-Brexit and not really a fan of the Boris Johnson style of politics that we've seen from the Conservative Party for the last few years. So I don't think it's a huge shock that the Lib Dems are doing well there. I just think, you know, what would be a shock is if this was the beginning of their upsurge and maybe they went on to take more constituencies in the election.
I think crucially, historically, the Lib Dems had a very good reputation for performance in local elections. They had a very good ground game. They would win by-elections that they weren't expected to win. Since 2010, that hasn't really been the case. You know, the coalition really drove a lot of their former supporters away. Ed Davey and his team have really focused on rebuilding their ground game, their local capabilities, which allows them to pick up these areas which, as Chloe says, are likely to be fertile territory, target them very directly and win there. A few years ago under Jo Swinson, who said she was going to be the next Prime Minister, was at one point polling over 20%, but could never show the results in electoral terms, that's turned round.
Just an anecdote to illustrate that, in Windsor and Maidenhead, I went to visit the Lib Dem council candidates as they were then, and they gave me a kind of selection of their literature that they've been putting through doors. And I think they gave me 6 or 7 leaflets that they'd handed out in the past week and a half alone. And,
wow.
You know, and it was all hyper-localised and very anti-conservative. Like, this is how we get the Conservatives out. And this is what we want from Windsor and Maidenhead.
And there were some other big results, weren't there? I mean, it was a good night for the Greens, by all accounts. Very bad night for Reform UK. I think that's what they're called these days. What's your read on some of the kind of smaller parties?
Well, for the Greens, they said before the local elections that their real aim was to win full control of Mid-Suffolk Council. And to be honest, the fact that they actually did it, I think, is a real sign of their... Again, this is a party very good at local campaigning, campaigning very much on local issues. But the narrative that they want you to know is that they're also going to try and win the constituency there. They want to win their second MP. There's a new constituency being formed with the new boundaries there. And their co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, is going to be the candidate. Their argument is that this is a sign that they're on the up. I mean, this is the first time they've ever had full control of a council in the country and in Europe. So, you know, it is still a success for them.
Wow, that is big. And Reform UK, so for listeners who, like me, are catching up with the ever-evolving Reform UK picture, were the Brexit Party founded by Farage, and don't seem to have that sparkle that he brought.
Exactly. So reminder, Nigel Farage left UKIP just over 5 years ago when it essentially collapsed. Now I think we can say that UKIP itself has pretty much totally collapsed. They lost every council candidate they stood.
I didn't even know they were running.
They did. Yeah, I mean, exactly. They are such a spent force. Reform UK, in theory, has taken on that mantle. You know, Nigel Farage is their president or something like that. They did have an impact at the last general election. This time, they picked up a tiny handful of councillors. Actually, nationwide, I think their share of the vote was about 6%, which is not nothing. But their ground game was clearly terrible because that 6% did not translate into the sort of dozens of councillors it should have. It was a tiny handful. There's no sign of them having any particular area of geographical strength where, crucially, they might be able to win an MP at the next election.
So what can we read into this results in a sort of bigger picture? Are Labour still in the position with the general election where it's kind of theirs to lose?
Yes, that is still true. National polls, we at the Eye, we carried a poll from BMG which showed Labour something like 14 points ahead of the Conservatives. That is a significant lead. It's not mid-90s Tony Blair style, but it is significant. It's more like David Cameron when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. David Cameron was routinely recording leads of that magnitude. He obviously went on to win the election. But only just, and that is the caveat. Keir Starmer is talking about preparing for a majority Labour government. That is perfectly possible, but polls have been closing. There remains a possibility that they might lose it. And after all, at the last general election, Labour was in such a bad position that actually getting a majority of one in the House of Commons would be quite an extraordinary achievement.
And with the Lib Dems as well, so we saw them do very well, but you mentioned that they do quite well in local elections. As we've talked about, their style of campaigning can be very localised. How do they then scale that up to the national picture? Are they likely to be as big a player in the general election?
Well, it comes down to them playing on this anti-conservative vote in areas where Labour just are never going to win. That's probably going to be their leading mantra. I think at the moment, recognition of the party and their key leadership team, Ed Davey, the leader, I don't think is very high among the general population. I also don't think their policies are very well known. But I would argue that probably the same applies for Labour. So I think next year and a bit, we're going to see a real push to make sure that each party is really selling what their core policies, their vision, if you like, as Labour's been calling it, to the country. And it remains to be seen whether the Lib Dems will be able to do that on a national scale or whether they'll simply be relying on the anti-Tory vote.
I mean, one of the big problems with the Lib Dems is, again, because their performance at the last general election was so dire, they ended up with, I think, just 11 MPs. If you could find me members of the public who could identify any Lib Dem MP other than perhaps Ed Davey and Tim Farron, who was a previous leader, I'd be extremely surprised.
I think I'd struggle.
Our politics team reports from the heart of Westminster and across the nation to shine a light on the work of government and to keep you informed around the clock. To keep up with all the latest news and features from them, consider a subscription. Go to inews.co.uk/podcast and get more than 30% off a digital subscription to I. I for open minds. Subscribe today. So let's get into some of the main fault lines for the general election, which I think the local elections have helped expose here. If you're Sunak, you're probably not feeling fantastically buoyant after all of this. What are you thinking in terms of next steps? Where does he go from here to boost the Tories among the general population?
So I think if you're Sunak, you are thinking this is a very clear reminder that the starting point for the Conservatives is not good. The political winds are against them. How do you get around that? Well, you do that by delivery. He's set out these 5 pledges, 3 of them on the economy, 1 of them on immigration, 1 of them in the NHS. It's no coincidence that this week, immediately after the coronation festivities are over, the government comes out of the block with a series of announcements on access to GPs, speeding up health treatments, better access to pharmacies. It's that sort of thing, showing that he has a plan, delivering on that plan. Some of that will be remarkably easy. For example, later this month, we will get the inflation figures for April. Because of the way inflation is calculated and the way energy bills have changed, it's almost certain that we're going to get a massive drop in inflation from over 10% to more like 7 or 8%. Now, that doesn't have much to do with Rishi Sunak, but he is going to jump on that as evidence that his plan is working. That very much relies on the plan working. And if the plan doesn't work, fine, yes, inflation is going to automatically come down, great news. But the other targets, particularly around NHS waiting lists and small boats crossing the English Channel, are really fairly out of the government's control. So it's a risky strategy, but it probably is the only one that has any possible chance of success.
And what did the local election results tell us about the sort of Tory strongholds? I mean, we spoke about a couple of them moving to no overall control or even swinging to the Lib Dems. How's the sort of so-called blue wall looking? Is it very sturdy? Is it a bit wobbly or is it falling over?
I'd say it's pretty wobbly. And this is the problem for the Conservatives. Labour targeting those blue wall seats with definitely some success. Mm-hmm. They're also targeting places like Swindon, Medway and Kent, parts of Essex as well. Meanwhile, the Lib Dems are making advances in the more traditionally liberal areas of the south of England, in Surrey, in Berkshire and throughout towards the southwest. There are very few areas of the country that you would now say are purely, solidly Tory. That said, they could lose 40 seats to the next election and still have a majority. So there are signs of weakness in almost all parts of the country. And Mid Suffolk, where the Greens one is a great example. That is a classic Tory area. It's been Tory for a long time, and yet that's fallen to the Greens. Will it fall to the Greens at the next election? Well, probably not. But that is something that the Tories now have to start worrying about.
Yeah. Well, the man who shored up a lot of this support was obviously Boris Johnson. So where does that leave Sunak then? I mean, his personal brand, very, very different to Boris Johnson's. Has that caused them any problems? Is he maybe too slick, too sharp and not quite Boris Johnson enough?
Well, his personal ratings are okay. He tends to get a net rating of about -10 to -15, which for a sitting Prime Minister is not too bad. Clearly, opposition parties believe that Rishi Sunak's background, his personal wealth, his previous career as a banker at Goldman Sachs, and the signs that he clearly doesn't live the sort of normal everyday life. I mean, no Prime Minister does really, but Rishi Sunak, there is a perception that is a bit more out of touch than the average senior politician. And that does mean I think it probably has made it harder to make that direct personal connection to voters on the campaign trail that Boris Johnson, despite in many ways being a highly unusual person with a highly unusual background, was able to make.
Chloe, do you think that harms him now, particularly because of the economic climate? You know, people are really feeling the pinch. He's presumably not.
I do think this attack line of Rishi Sunak being out of touch does land because he's not just wealthy, you know, he's extremely wealthy. That does make it hard for voters to be able to relate to him. But at the same time, people are complicated and they don't just want their prime minister to be a man of the people or a woman of the people. They, you know, want them to be a good leader. And I think it's interesting picking up on Hugo earlier describing Rishi Sunak. He said he was quite focused. He's not that charismatic necessarily. He's got his 5 pledges. I mean, who does that remind you of? It's basically a description of Keir Starmer. That indicates to me that this isn't going to be an election about personalities. It's going to be an election on policy. And that is what needs to land, as opposed to being the biggest personality in the room.
There was a very interesting take from our chief political commentator, Paul Waugh, who suggested that there's potentially a return to tactical voting here. Is that what we're seeing? Is that one of the reasons they're bouncing back? And is that one of the things that could really cost the Tories?
Yeah, obviously, if you ask the Lib Dems or Labour this, they wouldn't say, yes, we have election pacts around the country. But I think that's clearly been the case in some areas where Labour just doesn't campaign. And I do think there's this unspoken agreement on a lot of the messaging being around getting the Tories out. Yeah. And I think we'll see that again in the general election. I'd be very surprised if that wasn't quite prominent.
And in 2019, there was a bit of tactical voting on all sides. Crucially, in some of those seats in southern England, there was anti-Labour tactical voting. The Lib Dems believe they lost, at least a dozen seats where they could have won because a lot of people who were not pro-Tories, probably not pro-Brexit, were so anti-Jeremy Corbyn that they went back to the Tories rather than risking a vote for the Liberal Democrats because they just didn't want to let in Jeremy Corbyn. Keir Starmer doesn't attract the same reactions, negative or positive, actually, as Jeremy Corbyn did. So you're not going to see widespread anti-Labour tactical voting in the way that you did in some areas last time, which again is bad news for the Tories, good news for Labour.
Yeah, the Conservatives are very quick to get very angry and upset about any kind of tactical voting, but they've done it themselves. I mean, I'm not sure, but I think it was in 2019 when Boris Johnson made a deal with, was it the Brexit Party at that time? So that they wouldn't stand to divide the Brexit vote.
For so long in our politics, Brexit was this sort of looming spectre over the top of everything. And it feels like maybe that's not the case anymore. To what extent is Brexit still a part of these results?
I think they're a part of the political discourse to the extent that people are pleased that the Conservative Party, quote unquote, got Brexit done. I think that was quite a key messaging for them. And that does register with voters. But it's not an issue that I have heard coming up again and again in these local elections or the local elections last year when the other seats were up. People are very much preoccupied with cost of living and the economy and issues affecting them in their day-to-day rather than this slightly obscure notion of Brexit. I think there's been some work trying to nail down Labour on what their post-Brexit future relationship with the EU will look like. And I imagine that will come up again in the lead up to the general election, especially if there's suggestions of a hung parliament or a very slim majority. All of these things could affect what that next relationship with the EU will be. But I don't think it's the prominent issue that it is. I don't think it's the dividing line. And I don't think it's the party you vote for depends on your stance of Brexit, which was for many years. I don't think that's still the case.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak is going to have a real dilemma in the run-up to the next general election because on the one hand, he likes to think of himself as the Prime Minister who really got Brexit done. Boris Johnson got a new deal with the EU and obviously won the last election on the basis of that. But there was lots of unfinished business, particularly in Northern Ireland. Boris Johnson himself soon admitted this. And it was Rishi Sunak who more or less resolved that earlier this year. So that's his image. Rishi Sunak will be very tempted to try and play those old tunes, particularly against Keir Starmer, who was the architect of Labour's pro-second referendum Brexit policy, now essentially disavows it, now is, pro-Brexit. And there was another reminder of how this might play out this week. The SNP put out a release saying that if there is a hung parliament, the SNP will have 2 prices to pay for propping up Labour. Number 1, unsurprisingly, a second independence referendum in Scotland. But number 2, a commitment by a Labour-led government to forge a closer relationship with the EU. This will have been music to the Tories' ears.
Yeah. Well, we know that Starmer has suffered from his so-called flip-flopping on his Brexit position, among a couple of other things. Has he set out the rest of his vision enough? Do we know what he stands for other than the flip-flops?
So this is a point of contention, I think. I think if you asked him that, then yes, he's definitely set out his position in great detail. Whether any of that's got through to voters, I've got no idea. I mean, he's got these 5 missions. I can't even remember them off the top of my head.
I was going to challenge you to this, Chloe. Can any one of you name the 5?
I could probably make an educated guess, get most of them right. And each of the missions is like a huge policy area, right? Like healthcare, the economy.
Yeah.
You know?
It's just a department each, really, isn't it?
It's not a succinct message, you know? It's not like a 3-word slogan that's going to win you an election.
Mm-hmm.
I know that their plan for the next year is to really try and push these policies, but I think he really needs to, in my opinion, and I'm not a Labour advisor, but I think he should be distilling his message a lot more if he wants it to land in any way, shape or form. I mean, I guess you could argue, a cynic might argue, that some of these mission announcements, like, for example, economic growth, are just as much aimed at us lot in the Westminster media as they are at the average voter on the street. But I think that's the next stage, is getting to those people.
So what are they telling you, your many, I imagine, Labour sources, about the way that they're going to tighten up this message? Is it to really sort of drill down on that policy? Are they going to sharpen up the line? Are we going to see a sexy slogan? Where do they go from here?
Well, they've been quite vague about what their election campaign plan's going to be, understandably. But I think they really want to make a strong argument on public services, things like the NHS, things like education. Their most important message is being the party of the economy. Labour's never had an easy time of reassuring voters that they can be trusted with the economy.
Yeah.
And the whole Liz Truss fiasco has really played into their hands now. So I think they're really going to push hard on any kind of public service reform, repairing the NHS, all underlined with, but we're not going to be just spending. We're going to be doing it in a strategic way.
Even that's quite a complicated message, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's not education, is it?
And it's not a big part of Corbyn's message. And actually, if you drilled down, it was a lot more complex than this, for good or for ill, but was reverse austerity. That's not the message anymore. Labour is not promising to reverse all of the cuts that have been made over the last 13 years. Instead, they're saying they will improve public services with some strategic investment, but then also with reform. Well, whether or not that's a good idea, as you say, it's relatively complex. It's not particularly sexy.
Yeah.
And by the way, it gets you into massive fights with the existing actors within the NHS, the doctors' unions, with the teachers' unions, who tend to like being told that they'll get a lot more money and not like being told that the way they're doing things is all wrong and has to be totally overhauled, perhaps unsurprisingly. So it is a tricky position. I mean, I think we'll hear more about the detailed policies over the next few months, heading into Labour's party conference in autumn, which may or may not be the last party conference before the election. But they clearly do have work to do in sharpening up their message.
There's a lot of talk about the possibility of a hung parliament. It seems like Labour are going to come out on top here, but not with that landslide that was talked about a few months ago. What do you think the chances are of a hung parliament? And if so, what does it look like?
Let's start with a caveat. The election is almost certain to take place in the next 18 months. Remember what politics was like 18 months ago and everything that's happened. Everything that's happened since then. 18 months ago was the very start of Partygate, but Boris Johnson was still riding high. So my only point here is a lot can change in that period of time. But if we remain on the course we're currently on, a hung parliament is a definite possibility. I mean, I think if you look at the bookies' odds, it boils down to essentially there's more or less a 50-50 chance between a Labour majority and a hung parliament with a very small chance of a Tory majority. So while it's something that certainly Labour will never talk about out loud, they will be planning for it behind the scenes.
Just finally, before we wrap up, are there any big incidents or opportunities that are on the horizon which could provide a kind of final steer towards who gets into number 10? What should we be looking out for?
I mean, I can't think of a specific event off the top of my head, but the thing that jumped out to me when you asked that was, I guess, a lot of this is riding on the real unknown as to what happens with the war in Ukraine and the current foreign policy. You know, we've got a lot of diplomatic events coming up in the next few months. Obviously, the war is ongoing. It's been a huge issue. The way things have been going so far is that there doesn't seem to be much else other than kind of real support from the British public, but that's a real unknown. We just don't know what's going to happen there.
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily point to an event. I would point to 3 numbers. The first number is the European gas price, which is now about half what it was expected to be just a few months ago. That is going to govern inflation. That is going to have a serious effect on economic growth. and also on the government's ability to balance the books. Second number I'd look at is NHS waiting lists, specifically perhaps the number of people who are waiting more than, say, 6 months for a non-urgent operation. And the third number I would look at is the number of asylum seekers who are crossing the channel in small boats. Number 1 and number 2, the gas price and the NHS, those will determine more than anything else the answer to, do people feel well off? Mm-hmm. Do they feel their personal situation and the country as a whole is improving at the time of the next election? The immigration issue, clearly less central, but that will answer the question in some ways, is Rishi Sunak in control in a way that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were not?
Well, it's going to be a very interesting 18 months, isn't it? Thank you so much. That is all from us this week, but you can follow Hugo and Chloe's reporting as well as breaking news, in-depth features and insightful political analysis at inews.co.uk. As ever, we would love to hear your feedback, so drop us a line at podcasts@inews.co.uk. I'm Molly Blackall. You can find me on Twitter at Molly Blackall and on Instagram at molly.blackall. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.